Yo, what's up, world? It's Patrick Lovell coming at you on December 9th, which is a Friday at 10:29, 10:30 a.m. my time. And it's still 2022. And sometimes I wake up like it's Groundhog Day trying to sort out what day it actually is. And you know what's really wild to me is that the whole world is absurd. I was watching this amazing podcast this morning. Two guys that I respect, I like to listen to, pretty popular in the podcast space. One guy's name is a pseudonym called CoffeeZilla, and from what I understand, he's also the entity's been involved with Netflix documentaries. I don't know exactly to what ends. I suspect it might be involved with Vox or something along those lines. But he was being interviewed by a gentleman by the name of Lex Friedman, and if I think a lot of you who pay attention to podcasters understand that Lex Friedman, very, very smart guy, genius probably, intellect out of MIT, who is very within the world of Joe Rogan, and might even be a filter to Joe Rogan. And he did this interview with CoffeeZilla, who's been really all over the map and really prescient with a lot of his coverage of SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, and the FTX debacle and everything as it relates to Alameda Research. But as I was listening to this, without having done a whole lot of research on CoffeeZilla, I wasn't, well, let's put it this way. I was a little bit confused how these guys could be so detailed in their analysis, but while missing the entire point. It was almost as if, and my gut tells me, that CoffeeZilla may be involved in some capacity with crypto or Bitcoin or some sort of coverage and leverage over the course of whatever time he's been online. I've just recently discovered him, but he's very smart, very apt, knows a lot of details, but he is missing the most important detail of all as he was relating to Lex Friedman, who doesn't understand this stuff, but who is, quite frankly, a physicist and an engineer who understands probably at the micro level details and analysis of how things work on a level that I could never comprehend. But in this layout that CoffeeZilla, tried to frame what was happening in terms of what could potentially be the fraud as it related to the FTT tokens, that they just basically stepped over like a puddle of mud. The detail of how market makers within the fold of FTX, or I should say Alameda, put value to tokens made up out of thin air that were then used in all of these collateralized trades that ultimately would create the run that bankrupted FTX and $8 billion went missing, okay? Among other things. My point isn't to litigate what's happening with FTX right now as much as to make this corollary to disinformation and misinformation in media, and ultimately as it relates to everything that I've been laying on you. So, I'm not sure if Sam Bankman-Fried knows the information that I've been laying on you. Maybe he watched the con, quite frankly. Maybe he studied the con before he even got into crypto and FTX, and maybe that's why, in a nutshell, he did what he did. I sometimes have the same feeling that that's what happened with the Trump camp, that the Trump camp studied the con and then came up with their version of how they could continue the manipulation and the criminal fraud that they've been engaged in for some time to be able to try to create outcomes that they do. The way I'm looking at the universe and the way the game is played in 2022 is that there's a giant disconnect. There's a giant gulf. There's a canyon between those in the know, those that have access to big money, those that are in the financial sphere that can game what we all assume to be the economy towards outcomes that are baked into everything that we reveal to you in the con. Two elements of it that neither of these guys are aware of are A, control fraud, and B, gambling for resurrection. Both of those things we learned from the master who actually put those in courts around the country through the media that created 30,000 criminal referrals that led to 1,000 criminal convictions in the savings and loan debacle, which was 180th the size of the great financial crisis. Now, what's interesting about all of this stuff is that Sam Bankman-Fried, if he either really fully understood what he was dealing with, but the kid is a kid. He's 30 years old. He doesn't know shit. He came out of grad school. He's a fucking math genius. Came out of the best, private high school and worked his way through the system. It's almost like he was born into the Borg. His parents are these compliance attorneys that are at the top of the game out of Stanford, and then of course he ends up at MIT, and he ends up at this huge hedge fund whose name eludes me at the moment, and then he winds up doing these what they call arbitrage trades based on the Comanche yield because they were paying a higher premium for Bitcoin and crypto and North Korea or South Korea. And then it's all interesting to me more so now that I've learned that China put an end to crypto over a year ago and trading, which would have put a lot of the, shall we say, investment opportunity from the masses in China offshore. That would have led to Hong Kong, which was, of course, the original FTX, I think, exchange before it moved to the Bahamas. But all of this, globalism and, the tricks of the trade and financialization and everything else and financial engineering, it has these sort of signatures of what's come before over and over and over in the modern era since the savings and loan crisis. And what happened in the savings and loan crisis is that government actually had the wherewithal and the people within the departments of regulation that knew exactly what they were looking for, what they were looking at, and they put together the elements of the crime that ended up creating these criminal referrals that led to indictments and ultimately prosecutions of white-collar executives, which hasn't happened since. Now, it did to a degree during the Enron era and WorldCom scandals, but not as precise as took place in the S&L crisis. And then ultimately, that was the last era of effort because we got overwhelmed with the great financial crisis. And that's been our reality ever since. But Sam Bankman-Fried either knowingly or interestingly interpreted what ultimately the Federal Reserve did in monetary policy, which is extremely ironic considering the whole purpose of Satoshi Nakamoto and Bitcoin and crypto designed to create the blockchain, to create the transparency in transactions so that this supposed collateralization that blows up the world that leads to fiat currency going to the wrong places obsolete. But we can tell that that's absolute horseshit because anywhere where there's major money is centralization, and ultimately these sorts of scenarios that are cons that feed the kitty for those that can provide that type of capital that they can pull out before the retail investors get in and they pull the plug and then they fucking drop the roof on everybody, which appears is what happened at FTX. But the reason why all of this matters and why I'm telling you this is because, look, again, I announced my presidency for the 2024 election, a couple of weeks ago, and I got so ridiculous as to challenge, and I mean it, but at the same time, it's ridiculous in so much that I wish the world wasn't like this, like Sam Bankman-Fried said. I wish the world wasn't like this, but it is. And it's like the only people that are paying attention to people, in a mass way, are those who don't understand how the system works. And so they look for like these sort of scapegoat opportunities that sort of present themselves with yay, and then, Fuentes and anti-Semitism and, the deep state and, the new version of blood libel, which is Pizzagate and Q type stuff, which ultimately all seems to be this sort of upswell for whatever you want to, interpret as Trumpism. What I look at and what I interpret it all to be is just a fixation with what becomes fascism. If you understand Q and you understand, deep state and all of these corollaries, the irony of this whole thing specifically to what it is that I know, and this is reality, and I'm pulling back the curtains again to reveal how the machine actually works versus what idiots, particularly in media, don't understand to be able to tell you the ABCs of how these cons work and to what end, and ultimately what they reveal about our society. So yeah, there is a deep state. There has been a deep state in the United States going back to right after World War II when we created the CIA. And the CIA has been deeply involved with all sorts of insane calibrations around the world to foster what would be leverage for our geopolitical aims. That's why we were a superpower in conflict with the Soviet Union and everything that happened post World War II that created the world that we live in. A lot of us would like to look you know, um, fondly on the sort of era of, like, let's say MI6, right, and James Bond, and really all of those real stories that manifested that fictional character. I mean, yeah, there was a Cold War. There was a battle over sort of this configuration of what the ideology was going to create in terms of economic systems. Capitalism versus communism ultimately was the outcome, right? And so the notion now, particularly with a lot of people that are just like besides themselves at seeing this rot in American society, always want to blame capital. But to me, capital is like fire. Can you see a difference, for example, between the usage of fire for heat, for warmth, for cooking, and of course, arson? That to me is the way you should look at the granular detail of what capitalism is. We all need capital to survive, unless we're going to be independent and we're going to live on our own land and we're going to hunt our own food and grow our own food, have our own energy and everything that we need to survive, which would be, of course, incredibly difficult for most of us. I certainly couldn't do it. So we depend on society, and society's got to be structured. And our society was structured such that we supposedly have the law to hold power to account, which is, of course, the whole premise of the revolution and what led to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And ultimately, in 2022, after decades and decades of the deep state and erosion, ultimately by our professionals within the machine, based on this financialization predicated on 4 decades of neoliberalism that basically created globalism so that the middlemen can make all the money on fees while selling out the production to try to get the lowest cost, and efficient ways of delivering it to market and all that kind of stuff, so that people, mostly buy the cheapest goods that are accessible for their needs, which creates a market for a race to the bottom. All of these things go in a myriad of different directions. And my whole philosophy, and it's not even a philosophy, it is and it's not a philosophy, it's the way I engage life. It's the way I've always engaged life, right? I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a competitor, I believe in free markets because I believe that the best rise to the top, and they should do so based on competition. That does not mean that I don't believe in a democratic socialized state under certain circumstances, for example, like the New Deal, after the collapse of really the global economy based on what was the same type of frauds that took place to create the crash of 1929 that ultimately led to the Great Depression, that ultimately led to the birth of fascism and communism, but ultimately into us determining the next level of democracy was going to be predicated on new new statutes and legal parameters, particularly as it relates to financial markets, which ultimately birthed what was called through Glass-Steagall and then ultimately the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 and 1934 and the Securities and Exchange Commission, which are cops on the beat, because if you're a company selling securities, that you have to have reps and warranties that you're accountable to, which brings us back to FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried and the misinformation that happens all over the place as it relates to what it is that I'm trying to get your narrow focus to understand and break through the dystopia that nobody seems to want to understand. That yes, it's corruption, but you need to know who did what, when, and how, and why, and towards what ends. And so ultimately, me, Patrick Lovell, the only guy that exists that is explaining to you bit by bit with details. This isn't me making this up. This isn't me theorizing. We did the work that created, 10 years of effort and millions of dollars to get this story complete, which leads to the revelation that Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which is the statute that gives the power to the Federal Reserve to be the lender of last resort to our economy so that we don't collapse. But it's predicated on A, collateral, and B, really the common sense of what's supposed to prop up the economy. But what was revealed after 2008 was that our economy is financialization. Our economy is the shadow sector made up of too big to fail banks, which are called systemically important financial institutions, which we call primary dealer brokers, that feed through low interest, to however you want to use the capital to get into the gatekeepers that deal with money making money in the forms of private equity or asset managers or hedge funds and other downstream sort of scenarios that aren't necessarily the sorts of things that capitalism is defined to be able to create, right? Which is the most efficient use of capital towards the most productive ends at the highest profit for the best use in society. That's its ideal, quite honestly. That's not what capitalism is now. Again, go back to the very beginning of what I said at the outset of this truth bomb, which is, do you know the difference in usage of fire between heat and control and comfort and food and so forth, cooking of food so that we don't get sick, that sort of thing, versus arson? You got to think of capital like that now, which is what leads me to reveal to you that we don't live in a democracy. The rule of law is not equal. There is a line, a demarcation line, where those of us below the line are thought of as expendable by those above the line, and also the law and free markets are completely, what we're in the midst of. It's a free for all. It's a wild west for us down below, but those up above have complete control and complete backstop, and they're above the law. So as we reveal in the con, that the housing collapse that led to the global derivatives collapse was all built on quicksand of fraud, or I should say sawdust, right? The foundation was bullshit because ultimately the collateral was hyper evaluated and rolled over until ultimately it couldn't go on any longer until the market bet against it, and because it's a casino. But you're not the one that knows who you don't know what cards you're holding versus what the house is holding. And by the way, there's been this revelation with FTX and the chief regulatory officer for FTX, a guy by the name of Dan Friedberg, apparently came from some online poker gaming scenario to where he was actually caught covering up for the CEO of the online poker company that was using a software, a God program to read everybody's cards to cheat them. I mean, that's who Sam Bankman-Fried hired as his chief regulatory officer, which goes into the whole schematics and the details of control fraud and why you hire people that don't understand credit risk, that aren't going to do it, that you can control. Because if you're a CEO, you can backdoor the situation, which is exactly what Sam Bankman-Fried did. And ultimately, he was mirroring because of the other point that I brought up earlier in this dialogue, which is that they created value out of thin air for FTT tokens that were brought to market by market manipulation by market makers that were insiders at FTX and Alameda that were investors that gave it value out of thin air. So that if you build an economic engine on something that is worth nothing, what do you expect the outcome to be? All of it was just gaming the system so that people who are probably stuck in their jobs, retail investors who don't have a lot of income, use whatever income they could muster outside of what was taking place, let's say during COVID, and so-called, additional, money that people could pull from PPP loans or whatever their scenario was, with some of the backstops during the COVID relief bill that provided people income when their jobs came to a grinding standstill. So they started looking for other ways to gamble, which led to meme stocks and the stuff that took place with the apes, of course, and AMC and I can't think of the other one off the top of my head, but that was a big deal last year, which seems like a long time ago now, but yet at the same time it feels like yesterday, right? Because all of the stuff that I'm revealing to has been our system for the last 13 years, since 2009, because of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 pumping trillions of dollars of liquidity to the bankrupt financial shadow sector that got that way because of criminal fraud on a level never before seen. Was just literally what it seems FTX seemed to be aware of in what built its business model that everybody's now crying about. Where's the regulation? It's like, where's the beef, right? Back in that commercial back in the 80s. Where's the regulation? So, I mean, money is speech. Money is what enables the likes of Elon Musk to buy Twitter based on leverage and borrowing because of the scenario that I've been laying out to you that gives him the opportunity to suddenly proclaim that he's the guy that's going to champion free speech for everyone else, when indeed what he's doing is he's championing his own free speech. He's working with Matt Taibbi to reveal things that are hot button issues that could actually lead to more fascism, right? I say that corruption births fascism. And ultimately, that's what we all who love democracy and free markets and honesty and integrity and credibility and all of those things that you might think back to a bygone era of American character. That's who I am. I believe in just fucking calling a spade a spade. If you get cheated at a poker table, you get up, you pull your guns out, and you fucking start firing, right? Because that's what happened in the Old West. You were either black hat or a white hat. At least that's the idea it was depicted in Western films. But in reality, what we're trying to tell you is, and this is Obama to the ultimate, revelation. You get to the back of the bar, you go through the bar in the Old West, and you get your drinks, and you walk back to the back, and you find that the black hat is counting money with the white hat. And that white hat may as well have been Barack Obama. Because Barack Obama comes in on change we could believe in, and then he puts in all the bastards in power that created this disaster to begin with, and they let Wall Street get away with it, only to double down, which is now our entire system. And so it's just a race to the bottom. It's a jungle. It's insane. And nobody in media can tell you the truth. Nobody in any level of media, from mainstream, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Chicago Tribune to the Los Angeles Times, to Joe Rogan and his feeder Lex Friedman, and of course Rusty Rockets and everybody in between. They don't know the details of fraud. They don't know the details of policy. They don't know what is criminal, what is felonious, that are felonies. They don't know how to actually prosecute these, so they just speculate in circles, and everybody's like, "Oh wow, this seems kind of familiar." But nobody knows what the fuck's going on. Meanwhile, it's the same story every single time. So what I'm asking you to consider is that me and my angels, Roseanne Rabiola Mile and Paris Dubé and Rebecca Weesey, we've been in this game for like the last 7 months nonstop to try to press forward the truths that we reveal in the con to get everyone to understand that Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally to backstop a criminal apparatus that is now Wall Street. That is 2 steps away, and I wouldn't even call it 2 steps away. They are the mafia. That's how this works. That's what the mob does. They cheated cars. They have the casino. They do everything under the sun until they became legal and, that sort of thing. And then they, cleaned up a bit, if you will, right? Only to just take over the entire system. One day, one way, somehow, I will find out where that nexus is. And I know it's all over Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco, LA, Houston, Miami. We've had this sort of underworld for a very long time that the overworld and the overlords have used to their advantage the whole time. I said it yesterday. Bastiat said this during 17th century France, which was pre-revolution, where, of course, I had mentioned like the likes of Marie Antoinette were beheaded in the aristocracy of France in the context of what he said: when a group of men discover plunder in society, they devise a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. That's really what the deep state is as it relates to media. But ironically, the deep state is also used to manipulate those that are naturally paranoid. And there's this kind of, top-down paternal white sort of privilege, sort of formulation of it all, where a lot of people can be attracted and look to blame the other guy, right? They can look to blame everybody but the source of their malcontent, which is this power that I'm talking about, which is corruption. I dare say that there's so many more things that unite us than, divide us. But unfortunately, that can't happen when everybody is listening to the wrong voice. I hope somehow, some way that I can penetrate the insane noise out there to get you to understand that I have the answers. I have spent years and years accumulating, aggregating, doing the study, the tens of thousands of hours requisite necessary to understand what it is that I'm dealing with, so I can stand here in a scenario that is just the complete opposite of someone like Andrew Ross Sorkin at the New York Times in the Deal Book Conference to ask Sam Bankman-Fried a bunch of lob ball questions that get us nowhere, that basically hide the ball more than reveal what was actually going on. Why the New York Times is involved with this right now is anybody's guess. I suspect there's a little bit of embarrassment by way of FTX, providing so many millions of dollars to the Democratic Party, and who knows where that ends. But as I've stated previously, he also did it to the Republican Party. So for anybody out there right now that are, buying into the sort of the mainstream narrative that Sam Bankman-Fried's a good guy that maybe just got in over his head, that didn't know what he was doing, they don't understand what the fucking situation is or what he did and how he did it, which is what I'm trying to tell you. But in the case of how simple it is to arrive at one intersection of it all, i.e. Federal Reserve 13.3 being used illegally to backstop a criminal syndicate in the United States that is now our financial system, the same thing happened at SBF and, or I should say FTX in Alameda. They were simply creating a value of a token out of thin air that they used as collateral that was hyper appraised, that they used investment funds to bet all over the place. That's what banks do. That's what too big to fail banks did in the 2008 great financial crisis, and quite frankly before, which is the centerpiece of everything. If you want regulation, yes, there are ways to get cops on the beat and the right people within the institutions of the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the FBI, as well as the Department of Justice, because I found them. And they are superheroes. They are the League of Justice. And this whole thing is Gotham. My name is Patrick Lovell, and I ask you to consider, investing $13 into our campaign to purge corruption. If we had 10 million of you giving us $13, we would be able to overcome the noise with the media necessary to be able to put all of this together. We've already done it. We've already spent millions upon millions of dollars getting to this point. But in the end, the Borg is more powerful than we are. And I keep coming to this end game, which just depresses me to no end, but I got to blast through it. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I have this ongoing dream all the time where it's, I go back to my junior high school football days. And I remember there was this one practice where I had always started on defense and I was an outside linebacker and a middle linebacker, but our starting fullback got injured. So the coach asked me to play fullback, against the A team, so they could get practice before this big game that we were playing. And he let me play fullback. And I just, was up against all the studs of my football team. And I had no line. And so I kept plowing into the line head first as hard as I could over and over and over. And I was getting my ass kicked. But man, I just, for some reason, the harder it became, the harder I pushed. And I kept driving and driving and driving. And lo and behold, there was one play where I freaking bounced through the line into the secondary and I blasted through arm tackles, and I freaking just ran to freedom and I just plowed into the end zone. That's what this is. That's what I'm doing now. My team and I are plowing this truth into this damn, huge, polluted facade of people's minds and ways of getting information so that I can continue to pound the rock of truth over and over and over until I break through, man. And I swear to God, if you join me, if millions of you get on board and you donate $13 to this end, it's going to benefit you in ways that are immeasurable. Because right now, the power has an iron grip over everything, and they're stealing from us our future and the ability to sustain ourselves. And above all else, I say that corruption births fascism. There will be pushback. Like I've said before, it still astounds me to this day that during the insurrection, after years and years and years of corruption, that the people that showed up to actually, do what the founders of the United States had intended, that, an informed populace would revolt and hold power to account, in this particular incident, turned out to be fascists or white supremacists or people that are like, you know what? We want the power. They certainly don't care about democracy. They just want to create an authoritarian white supremacist make America great again, which is, by the way, came from the KKK, and Hitler actually had significant interest in because of the Jim Crow laws and everything we did with North Americans. America, as it turns out, one part of our history that we never necessarily celebrate, turns out it was an inspiration to Adolf Hitler, of all things. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Guys, this is just our turn. It's our time. We're in the game at this stage of the game. And if you believe in democracy and liberty and justice for all and integrity and justice, you've got to get on our side. And you've got to help lift this heavy burden of truth over the ocean of madness and lies. It's our only chance for survival. I hope you'll join us.